Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Antonio Zappula. I'm CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where we work to strengthen free, fair, and informed societies. You can find, if you want some more information about our work, on trust.org. And I'm delighted to be in the company of such a great panel of speakers to really discuss what is the biggest threat to media freedom. And I really want to be clear that this is not a niche issue that we are discussing here today, because when the law is weaponized to silence journalists and to threaten journalists, to stop the flow of free, fair, and accurate information, our democratic values are actually being eroded. And this is why at the Thomson Reuters Foundation we focus on strengthening free, fair, and informed societies, because when the free flow of information, of independent information, is stopped, there are no free societies. And this is really not a philosophical construct, and we've seen it really well in these past 2 years of a pandemic. We've seen firsthand the importance of accurate and independent information. And we know that when free, fair information is not flowing, we are creating the conditions for autocratic regimes to flourish. So we've seen this firsthand with results of elections, participation, democratic participation, and even referenda in the past couple of years. So really the legal attacks against journalists should be a matter of interest and actually concern for everyone. And that's why we really wanted to discuss this topic today. In the past few years, we've seen legal attacks against journalists on the rise. We've seen new legal trends emerging. We've seen more and more journalists being at the receiving end of these attacks, and we've seen also some solutions being presented. So what we want to do here today is to really take stock, looking at the ongoing situation, looking at some of these new challenges that are arising, and also exploring some of the solutions. So without any further ado, I want to introduce the panel. We have Carlos Gallo, who's Senior Legal Officer at Media Defense, an NGO based in London that provides free legal assistance to journalists. We have Patrícia Campos Melo, who is a Brazilian reporter at the Folha de São Paulo, who's been experiencing direct legal threats and attacks for her coverage of the Bolsonaro presidency. And we have Keelan Gallagher, QC. She's a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers. She specializes in human rights and civil liberties. And Keelan has been defending some very prominent clients, including Maria Ressa and Jimmy Lai. We're not getting questions from the audience, however, we are getting questions from the audience. So if you want to raise a question to the panel, please tag me on Twitter. It's at Anto Zappula, that's Z-A-P-P-U-L-L-A, so double P, double L, and I'll bring the question to the panel. So Carlos, I wanted to start with you, because lately we have seen many more examples of legal attacks against journalists, and they've been very widely discussed and covered by the media. Obviously, Maria Ressa is a very good example here. Is it a perception that we're having that these attacks are on the rise, or is it actually factually accurate?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Antonio, and thanks for the invitation to be in the panel, and hello to my co-panelists. It's not a perception, and that's exactly our view at Media Defense. And I say that because the number of cases we support has doubled in the last year, and we have a huge amount of new cases coming through every week, and not only, we'll talk about more about that later, but not only the usual defamation cases, but a wide range of legal threats against journalists. And we have two programs, one on emergency defense and another program on strategic litigation. And in both instances, we're having to litigate more strategically to counter some of these threats and advance standards, but also we need to react even more than before. As I said, the number of cases have doubled in the last year.
Has your team grown, or has it remained the same?
Unfortunately, the team hasn't grown. We're still a fairly small team of 4 lawyers in the legal team fighting this more than hundreds of cases around the world, providing support to lawyers, obviously, on the ground, substantive support, but also financial support when they need that.
So in these hundreds of cases that you just referred to, what trends are you seeing?
Yeah, so the trends is a very interesting phenomenon, because a few years ago, you would talk about defamation probably as the main threat to journalists. You're sued because you published something, you're sued because someone didn't like what you published and want to silence you perhaps. But nowadays we're seeing a very, very creative use of the law against journalism and against free speech. Obviously, defamation and SLAPS lawsuits, strategic litigation against public participation lawsuits that are aimed to silence or to harass journalists are on the rise all over the world, not only in Europe, but also in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We see that number increasing, and it's quite concerning. But also other types, perhaps more subtle and intelligent uses of the law, such as social media laws that were passed in many countries in Africa, where users have to pay a fee, pay a tax to use social media, including journalists. Laws that require that journalists are registered with the Journalism Association, for instance, in order to be considered journalists and have speech protected. But also tax audits. So journalists accused of tax crimes and financial crimes. You see that in Russia, but we see also examples in Central America, in Guatemala and El Salvador, where independent outlets were targeted by the authorities, accused of money laundering because they're receiving foreign funds. That brings me to another issue, foreign funds. Obviously, we know that Russia targets media, but also lawyers who defend media outlets as foreign agents, and that creates a huge embarrassment in their daily work. So that's a trend that is growing, and the Russian playbook is being replicated in other countries. Most recently in El Salvador, they passed a similar law, which is very threatening to the very few independent outlets that remain, continue reporting in that country. Another interesting use of the law is privacy, so data protection. So we've seen a number of cases of very powerful individuals suing publications alleging violation of their data protection. So GDPR regulations in Europe and privacy, which is very concerning, and I think those cases should be thrown out quickly, but they're not. And we have outlets having to defend themselves for years and years in court because they published true information about powerful individuals or companies. Companies are using lawsuits or threats of lawsuits often, and these we often don't hear about, because when a small outlet receives a threatening letter from a powerful law firm saying that they're going to sue and they're going to bankrupt that outlet, what would they do? If they don't have support, if they don't have access to a lawyer, they don't know how to navigate the legal system, they might just take down the information and avoid all the problems that come with a lawsuit. So we see that happening more and more, both with real threatening letters, but also fake letters that are sent to independent outlets and independent...
Fake as in using fake, not being written by lawyers.
Exactly. So, yeah, we've identified that reputation management companies are sending fake letters pretending to be from legitimate law firms or legitimate EU lawyers. And those who receive those letters fall for the scam. It's a scam at the end of the day, and end up taking down that content. Or the MCA threats as well, letters that are sent to Google or to servers accusing those outlets of copying information from other sources. So that is happening. And the instinct, I think, is to retract or take down the information, and that, you're curtailing free speech, they're being censored effectively. Another quite strong trend is the right to be forgotten, particularly in Europe after the Castello case of the Court of Justice of the European Union. And we're trying to stop that. Media Defense intervened with partners recently in 2 cases before the European Court of Human Rights, where we feel that the use of this right to be forgotten is being abused by plaintiffs. And in one case, as a result of a lawsuit focusing on the right to be forgotten, an Italian medium had to shut down because they received so many requests for takedown requests And several of them actually went to court that they couldn't continue publishing. So we see concretely the danger of the use of these new legal threats against journalists. And finally, it's not much about perhaps legal threats, but I guess we might talk about it a bit later. The fact that journalists and freelance journalists, particularly who cover conflicts and are injured whilst covering conflict, are left without any resource or any recourse for justice. So we're looking at that, and we filed a lawsuit against Azerbaijan last year related to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where some journalists were injured and one was killed as a result of a bombing in the city of Martuni in the conflict area. So we see that as a very important area that needs to be explored. And I'd like to say that murders of journalists are, slowing down and ending. Physical violence against journalists is ending, but it's not. And that's another big area to discuss that we need to talk about.
We'll talk about impunity later also with Killen. I want you to move to Patricia. Patricia, you are a journalist who can personally relate to everything that Carlos pretty much said. If I'm not mistaken, I believe you currently have 36 lawsuits against you. On which grounds are you being sued? No, they're not 36. Okay, that's good news. Okay, so how many lawsuits?
Thank God, 3.
Oh, 3. Okay.
3, but the businessman who's suing me, he's suing 36 journalists.
Oh, okay, that's where the 36 came
the
from.
Figure.
But
yes.
on which grounds are you being sued, and by whom exactly?
Several. Okay, so here how it usually works. It's usually businessmen linked to the President Bolsonaro. So in one of the cases, for instance, it's something, again, that we were discussing. It's unimaginable that something like that would happen 4 years ago. A story I did using our Freedom of Information Act, so it's like documents, official information, and I'm being sued for that. It's a defamation lawsuit saying that it's fake news. And some of the judges, they use the word fake news, which is not like a criminal offense or anything. And this is official information from government documents, right? Regarding government spending on advertising on Google Ads. So one of the lawsuits is this one. The other lawsuit was President Bolsonaro himself was suing me to disclose all the sources from my reporting in 2018 and 19. He lost that one. And then there's one from this particular businessman who is very close to the president, and from what I understand from our colleagues in Turkey and in the Philippines, that's something that is frequent. You have you sort of outsource the judicial harassment to businessmen who are close to the president, and he's the one. He is suing 36 journalists and media outlets, and he's suing me, for instance, for 2 million reais. I mean, our currency is devalued, but that's like a lot of money. I've never seen anything like that in my whole life. It's like a lot of, I had never been sued. It's just like they use this, right?
Is the amount the same from the other 35 journalists?
No, I'm a lawyer, right? Because it's a legal defense. But think about among those 36, so many freelance journalists are being sued. So if I did not have this legal assistance, I would stop investigating. I mean, it's impossible. How can I think about, facing a lawsuit because of Freedom of Information Act-based reporting, being sued for that, and not having a lawyer? We just don't do that, right? So,
when it comes to the judiciary, how confident are you of the independence of the judiciary in Brazil? Because you just mentioned that you use Freedom of Information Act to conduct your investigation, and you are being sued on the basis of actually using Freedom of Information Act.
That's a very interesting question. We are very concerned about the possibility of Bolsonaro's re-election because he's been appointing judges in the superior courts and other courts, And as of now, there's sort of a balance in the Supreme Court. But if he's reelected, he's going to get to appoint another 2 justices, and that would change the balance, right? So far, it's very arbitrary. It depends on the judge who gets your case. And sometimes they're maneuvering to change the judge who's in charge. In my cases, for instance, a judge gave us a positive ruling, they changed the judge. And the new judge gave a negative ruling. So there's some very random, and I guess, I mean, as you say, Brazil is a democracy. We have checks and balances. But when it comes to the judiciary, as of now, it is working, but it really depends on who's the judge, right? We're totally dependent on if it's a pro-Bolsonaro or not judge.
Didn't you mention someone, I think this businessman suing in a specific jurisdiction, which is his hometown, because... Can you articulate on that? Because I remember having the briefing call where you mentioned that point.
Again. Yes. Well, yes, he does sue. He chooses his specific. He's from a very small town in one southern state. He's like billionaire, and so he sues almost everyone. Some of them in other states, but most of them in his town that is called Brusque, because that's his town. Right? So he chooses there, and he gets several positive results there. That's where we had this judge that had one decision, and then they changed the judge. So, you know, either you get lucky with the judge or you don't.
We'll come back to you, Patricia. Keelan, I wanted to hear from you. We spoke to Carlos about some of these new trends around the more creative form of attacks against journalists. Similar question to you, which trends are you seeing, and what are the implications of some of these new forms of legislation being weaponized against journalists?
Yeah, you probably noticed me nodding quite a lot when Carlos was speaking earlier, because I very much agree with the point he made about previously...
Can you use the mic a little bit?
Apologies. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Wonderful. Previously, we tended to see the weaponization of certain types of laws against journalists. So defamation was a very obvious one, or sedition and terrorism laws. But an increasing trend, which I'm seeing, reflecting what Carlos said earlier, is what Maria Ressa, my client, and I tend to call lawfare. So more creative, wide-ranging use of law as a weapon against journalists in a wide range of ways. So, for example, I'm seeing many cases which involve fraud and corruption charges being brought against my clients, and that sometimes quite old cases. So to give you one example, I acted a number of years ago for the editor-in-chief, Mir Shakil Mir Rahman, in Pakistan, the editor-in-chief of GOTV, or Jang Media Group. And in March 2020, this elderly man was arrested in relation to a property transaction dating back 34 years to 1986 by the NAB, in what was quite blatantly an attempt to use a different type of law to shut down a journalist and an attempt to silence a media organisation. We're also seeing copyright being used and intellectual property laws being used, and also increasingly the use of foreign agent type laws. So for me, I think you probably saw me jotting down here while Carlos was speaking. Seems to me there's 6 key trends that emerge from that I wanted to highlight for you. The first is it's harder for journalists to tackle these kind of threats, these legal threats, just in pure legal terms. So just very simply, it requires specialist lawyers. You may, as a media organisation or as a journalist, within a media organisation, much harder for freelancers, as Patricia has said, have specialist media lawyers ready to go on defamation cases, for example. But suddenly when you're facing intellectual property, land law, fraud and corruption charges, you need a whole range of legal expertise, which is often expensive, and they're less likely to be long-standing relationships that you have with the lawyers, and particularly difficult when you're dealing with freelancers. Second trend I'd identify from that is it's also much, much harder to tackle these kind of legal threats advocacy-wise, quite apart from tackling them legally. First of all, because mud sticks. So I find in many of my cases that there now is an increasing recognition that if defamation law is being used against a journalist, people get that. People get that this was a public interest piece of journalism which was published. It's quite wrong, the law is being used against them. It's much harder when the person's accused of being corrupt. And I do find mud tends to stick with some of these cases in a way that it doesn't with defamation. But also, many civil society organisations, people like the UN Special Rapporteurs and others, who we tend to turn to in free speech cases, frankly, many of these laws are outside their comfort zone too. It's much harder to encourage them to speak when it's a corruption case or a fraud case or something to do with a property transaction. It's quite difficult to stray into that territory. Third, often I'm finding that this involves the weaponisation of laws which were originally presented as being a positive thing for journalists. So fake news laws, media pluralisation laws, disinformation, even online harm, for example, in the UK, or as Carlos mentioned, laws relating to the registration of journalists with media organisations. So that's another trend. So things which are presented and initially come in as if they're a positive are then weaponised and turned against you. Fourth is facing legal threats on multiple fronts. So the way I describe it is, you know, that old fairground game of whack-a-mole where you've got to hit the hammer. So it's rather like that. You've got a defamation suit here, you've got a corruption case there, and that's exceptionally difficult for people to do. And even if you do have well-resourced media organisation, you've got lawyers who are fighting your corner. Very, very hard to do your job in those circumstances where you're having to fight these multiple battles. And I thought when Patricia said, it's only 3, and there was a kind of sigh of relief, you think how completely ridiculous that a journalist doing her job in this way, facing only 3 lawsuits is a positive thing. Yeah. You know, you look at, I act for the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia. When Daphne died, she was facing 40 lawsuits, in fact over 40 criminal and civil cases against her. And she's a freelancer, who was at the time described as being the conscience of Malta. And she was a very prolific journalist, and she's trying to do her job whilst also dealing with this multiplicity of threats. Fifth trend is picking up on what Patricia said. Often I'm seeing it's private businessmen or private individuals who are bringing these complaints. So someone complaining about an old property transaction, for example, or a businessman bringing a case. And often the state tries to say, nothing to do with us. These are just private individuals. And that's nonsensical because, of course, there's an obligation on states to foster an environment which enables journalists to do their job and to do their job free from threats of violence and free from spurious legal suits like this. So I do see that as a trend. And often it's pretty thinly veiled. It's someone who's very, very closely connected to the government. Sometimes it's a little more subtle. But ultimately what it involves is having a legal system which fails to ensure that journalists can do their job properly. And sixth, I find it often coincides with other forms of non-legal harassment, for example, online abuse, physical attacks, or indeed harassment of lawyers in civil society. One example, and then I'll keep quiet. Maria Ressa, many of you know her case, but what we find in her case is a good example of those trends that I've just identified. She faces a succession of cases that seek to criminalise her reporting, expose her to more than a century in prison. And she's doing precisely that kind of legal whack-a-mole that I described. She's having to face multiple cyber libel prosecutions brought by private individuals in some instances, but then weaponised by the state who've chosen to prosecute her, and indeed who've chosen to retain having a cyber libel law at all, despite the UN making clear to them a decade ago that that was a breach of Article 19 of the ICCPR. She faces 2 criminal cases alleging illegal foreign ownership in her company, spurious investigations of old tax returns. At one stage, Rappler's operating licence was revoked, and also Rappler's been vilified in presidential press conferences, their journalists prevented from attending press conferences, so it impacting on their news gathering as well. And that's precisely why the Filipino National Union of Journalists described her as facing a barrage of lawsuits which reveal a shameless act of persecution by a bully government. And that coincides with this climate of impunity. And last thing I'll say, I see a number of you in the room, including Julie Passetti, who were in Oslo when Maria collected the Nobel Peace Prize in December. And she collected the Peace Prize on the 10th of December at the end of that week. And she had her speech drafted earlier in the week, and we were working through it. One of the points she wanted to make right from the outset was that 21 journalists had been murdered in the Philippines since Duterte took office in 2016. And on the Wednesday evening, when she'd already sent the speech in for multiple translation, we found out that Jess Malaban, a Filipino journalist who was a friend of Maria's and someone she'd worked with closely over the years, had been killed. And we had to write in to say 21 is wrong, we've got to up the number to 22. And that's a real indication of how these lawsuits, the multiple legal threats that you face, often coincide with that climate of impunity, which essentially says journalists are fair game. You can attack them online, you can attack them on the streets, and you can attack them in the courts.
You know, we'll come back to you because I also want to talk about the other trend that we're seeing, which is some of the attacks now actually involving the lawyers themselves, and I'll eager to talk to with you. Carlos, we heard obviously a barrage of new creative ways of attacking journalists. What type of support is actually available there through media defense and other organizations?
Yeah, thank you, Antonio. That's very important. Obviously, if you can count on a world-class lawyer like Keelan Gallagher to defend you, you know, you're in excellent hands. But most journalists don't have that privilege, and as she mentioned, especially freelance journalists don't have the support from the medium where they work for, or any support at all. So there are a number of organizations that provide this legal support or financial support to cover legal costs, and one of them is Media Defense, where I work. As I mentioned in the beginning, we support hundreds of cases, more than 200 per year, and any journalist who's facing a legal threat can apply for a grant that will cover legal costs. We also represent journalists ourselves pro bono, usually before international courts. And I think quite important as part of this effort to support journalists in this environment, I'd like to mention the upcoming legal network for journalists at risk, which is an initiative that we're launching with the Thomson Reuters Foundation and CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and a group of core organizations to expand this sort of support that similar to what Media Defense already provides as a network of organizations that have joined together to provide whole support to journalists, not only cover the legal costs, but if necessary, provide trial observation, participate in their struggle for justice in a more complete way, if I could say that. Amicus briefs, certainly, exactly, a news gathering, collecting of evidence, sharing of experience as well, which is very important. So I think this network might expand the awareness about this problem, and hopefully more journalists will reach out and be supported, which is so important to keep them safe and out of trouble.
Thank you, Carlos. Patricia, in your opinion, how prepared are journalists in understanding the risk, the new risk that they're facing? I mean, listening to Keelan, it's pretty daunting. You know, we're talking about all sets of new threats, really. From your experience, how prepared or even aware are the journalists that they're now facing all these sorts of risks?
First, I wanted to say it's so good that you're launching this initiative, because I have so many colleagues who are, really difficult situation because they don't have any legal assistance, and all of us, it's like, why you have a job, you have a lawyer. If you don't have a job, you don't have a lawyer, but your lawsuit is still there. So thank you for this initiative. I think we are not prepared for that. I mean, when I stop to think, when we went to journalism school, what would you have to worry about? We worry about, checking your sources, documents, calling everyone, am I being fair? And then now you have to worry, okay, so am I going to be sued while using Freedom of Information Act? Or am I going to be sued for tax fraud? Are they going to check my tax returns? Or are they going to threaten my son? Are they going to make a porn video with my face on it? This is everything this is not journalism, right? I mean, it's not, it's just, so at one point, I bet so many people think, it's too high a personal cost, right? And financial, depending on, so I don't think, I mean, I was caught, it's just, I had never faced anything. Usually I was a foreign correspondent for many years. I covered conflicts and war zones. So I was not used, because you never get used, but, covering difficult situations. But when you become the target, right? Like you have lawsuits coming from all over, and then you have threats against you, against your family, in supposedly democratic countries.
Has he deterred colleagues of yours from either entering the profession or actually pushing them out of the profession because of this perception of bigger risks that they're now facing?
It's an excellent question. I'm not sure if it has deterred. I'm sure we all pause before we investigate something that we know is going to be uncomfortable for the government, because we tend to think, okay, I have to prepare. Where's the attack going to come from? And I guess it ends up in some sort of self-censorship, unfortunately. We're much more paranoid, about everything. And I am positive that many in the freelance journalists are not doing investigative journalism because they know they're going to be targeted with several lawsuits. There's no way you can do that, right? So it ends up being a kind of censorship. If you have people, okay, so I'm not going to write because I can't stand anymore this porn defamation, or my family. And then you have the independent guy saying, what if I get sued, I don't have a lawyer? You just don't, the investigation's not done. So we're not prepared.
Keelan, the legal profession is also increasingly coming under attack, and this is a relatively new trend that we're also seeing. Can you share some insights into that?
Yeah, of course. So I hope everyone can hear me. People obviously have seen some of the very high-profile cases of lawyers being targeted, so Sergei Magnitsky, for example, or indeed, as Maria pointed out in her Nobel Peace Prize speech, as well as the 22 journalists who've been killed under Duterte. There have been 63 lawyers killed under Duterte. So it ties in with another trend which I'm increasingly seeing in my cases, which is states using extraterritoriality, so the long arm of the state, to try to silence journalism about their country wherever it may be. So I'll give you two examples. So first example is Hong Kong, and second Iran. So with Hong Kong, for example, I act for Jimmy Lai. I lead the international team for him. And a number of weeks ago, we started being intimidated ourselves. And the argument which was being made in pro-Beijing media was that by instructing international human rights lawyers that Jimmy Lai and me, as his lawyer, were somehow colluding in undermining the state. And this was an example of me as an international human rights lawyer being a foreign agent with strong anti-China sentiment, a Western force attempting to undermine the government. So the argument was the very act of instructing an international human rights lawyer to vindicate your rights was itself a form of sedition, potentially a breach of the national security law. Now that's targeting both my client, Jimmy Lai, but it's also targeting me. And it coincides with quite a worrying example in Hong Kong in the last few weeks, when a small NGO based in London called Hong Kong Watch received a letter threatening them on the basis that in London, material they'd put on their website, statements which had been made to UK media, and comments which they made on their Twitter breached Hong Kong's national security law, because the Hong Kong national security law has extraterritorial reach. So that's a good example, I think, because it shows how the authorities in Hong Kong are determined to try to silence their critics wherever in the world they may be. Now, this comes a year after a number of parliamentarians and members of the European Parliament and civil society organizations were sanctioned by the Chinese for speaking out about the Uyghur, for example. So I think that's quite a worrying trend. The other example I wanted to give was Iran. And that's because for many years, of course, Iran has attempted to shut down independent investigative journalism, any journalism that's critical within its borders. We all know cases such as Jason Rezaian's, where simply for doing his job, he ended up imprisoned within Iran. But a very worrying trend is that Iran has now decided that's not enough, and that they're going to target journalists in exile around the world, wherever they may be. So I act for over 150 journalists at the BBC News Persian service, predominantly based in London, although many of them are based around the world. And they increasingly now face a range of legal attacks across the border. So Iran trying to reach out and to gag journalism which is critical of them, wherever it may be. So it includes, for example, and this goes back to the issue about creative use of the law and other tactics. It includes, for example, hauling in family members who still live in Iran, placing them in solitary confinement, or questioning them aggressively and saying, why is your daughter, son, brother over in London working for the BBC? Explain yourself. Why are they doing this? If you tell them if they stop working for the BBC or if they spy for us, we'll leave you alone. So that's weaponizing mechanisms within Iran to try to silence people externally. There's also an asset freeze, which means that people can't conduct property transactions, for example. And there are very significant threats, including death and rape threats, which people receive on a regular basis. Now, in circumstances where Ruhollah Zam, a journalist in exile based in France, a number of years ago was lured to a false meeting, purportedly with a source, and in fact was kidnapped and brought back to Iran, sentenced to death and killed, those threats have got to be taken very, very seriously. And it's one of the places where I think our legal system internationally breaks down, because actually all of our systems are predicated on the idea that the threat is coming to you from the country that you're in. So these are journalists who are based in Council of Europe country. They're based in the UK, but the Council of Europe safety mechanisms all assume that the state that's threatening you is also a Council of Europe country. And they're very difficult. It's very difficult to actually get any form of legal redress when you're dealing with a threat which comes from the other side of the world. But as we know, with the hijacking of the plane in order to bring a journalist back within your territory, back into Belarus, as we know from Jamal Khashoggi, as we know from Russia's extraterritorial assassinations, there is a huge issue about critics being silenced wherever they may be. And I think Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia are the well-known examples, but that's an increasing trend. I'm worried about it, and I think we need to be much more creative in how we use the law to tackle it.
So, Carlos, how are we using the law to tackle it? Can you give me an example of success cases that you handle at media defense, just to bring a little bit of hope in this conversation?
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. It gets gloomy quite quickly, right? I'm not sure it's a successful example yet, but the case against Azerbaijan regarding the Nagorno-Karabakh case, we're hopeful that it will be successful because it's the only possibility of redress for that family and for the journalists who were injured in that situation where they were in a sort of no man's land legally, so very difficult to establish jurisdiction in that case. And in other cases involving conflict at the European Court of Human Rights. So we're hopeful that that will be an interesting development. But I think a good news recently, I would mention the case of a journalist, Santiago O'Donnell from Argentina. He wrote a book about the brother of the former president of Argentina, Mariano Macri, and the book is called Brother. So he interviewed the brother for 20 hours and obviously did his research. And Santiago is an award-winning journalist. And after the book was published, he was offered money not to publish. He didn't accept. He was offered all the benefits. He didn't accept. After the book was published, he was notified of a lawsuit in which Macri wanted to have access to the tapes, the recordings. And so he outed himself as the source. So we're not exactly talking about source protection anymore, but we're talking about news gathering material. And Santiago adamantly said, no way, this is my professional investigative material. I can't give it to Macri. And interesting enough, I think it was clever on the part of the lawyers, there is no appeal against a decision in the Argentinian courts that order the tapes to be handed over. So the court ordered the tapes to be handed over, and we've been struggling with Santiago's lawyers in Argentina for a year and a half now, trying to stop it. We filed a case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to declare a violation of his rights. And finally, the Supreme Court intervened a month ago, suspending that first instance court order, and they will analyze the case. And hopefully that will lead also to a legislative change in Argentina, because that's a gap in the law that was cleverly used by their lawyers, and we hope to close that gap in the coming months. Another good use of the law, I'd say, is, well, the online space is, full of challenges, and online violence is so prevalent nowadays. But also, we've been looking at internet shutdowns and how they affect journalism. And we represented a group of NGOs and journalists in Togo before the ECOWAS Court of Justice, and we won the case that declared that the internet shutdown implemented by the government of Togo was illegal and ordered compensation to those journalists. And we're seeing that happening in so many countries. It's so easy for governments to stop the internet or throttle access to information. And we hope that will be an important precedent for other cases that we and others are also litigating. And I think the final example, and something that maybe it's not a good story yet, but I'm sure it will, refers to cyber spying and the use of hacking software, Pegasus, for instance. There are a group of organizations litigating these cases all over the world, and we are working on several jurisdictions, developing cases at the local level to bring also to international courts. And we hope to change the way governments are easily implementing and using these devices and software to spy on journalists, and which end up putting them at risk. It's a real concern, not only in authoritarian governments, but also in our democracies. Yeah. And so there are some positive developments in Mexico. Someone was already arrested for his involvement in the Pegasus scandal. I think it's the first case that was litigated by Article 19 in Mexico, and we hope to see more good developments in that front in the coming months.
Thank you, Carlos.
Welcome.
Patricia, you also have a success story that you can share. The way you use the law, to hit back, and it's a very powerful one.
I'm not sure if it's a success story. I mean, until now. Yeah, I sued the president, and we won.
So how can it not be a success story?
And his son as well. Well, basically, it's not something that we journalists do, right? But it got to a point that literally you had the president of a country going on live TV saying that you were offering sex in exchange for information, and that would not stop. So my perception was that how is this going to stop? And what's the next thing he's going to do? I mean, this has been done systematically with women journalists in Brazil. I mean, I have several colleagues. So I thought, okay, I had never sued anyone. It's not something that so I sued President Bolsonaro. We won. He's appealing. I sued his son. His son said that in the floor of Congress. Official speech, and then we won, and right after we won the case, he went on a podcast and he said again the same thing, as to say, they're appealing, and there's three other cases, this same thing. I think it's the last resort, of course, and it depends on you having, pro bono lawyer or someone who helps you, but it gets to a point that if we don't do anything, it's as if, it's fair game. They can do anything. They can keep on threatening. They can keep on, spreading lies. So we'll see.
And it's interesting that you said I never sued anyone, but I was forced to use the law to defend myself. And Keelan, I think I used this expression earlier talking to you. It feels like really a David versus Goliath battle here. But how can we then reclaim the original intent of the law to pretty much do what Patricia did?
Yeah, and I also have some good news stories. So believe it or not, despite the general tone of this discussion being rather depressing. So, I mean, first of all, there's using the law defensively in a way that protects you as a journalist. But I think we also need to think much more about using the law creatively in a proactive way. So on the defensive side, there are many good stories. I'm not sure how many of you were in the brilliant OCCRP session just before this one with Paul Radu. I mean, Paul Radu and OCCRP were sued in the London courts, so in the courts of England and Wales, by an Azerbaijani MP, another example of extraterritorial risks, libel tourism, an Azerbaijani MP deciding, I'm going to sue Paul Radu, who's not even based in London, in the London courts because they like their prospects of success in the London courts, and also it racks up a pretty huge bill. But actually there, three of my very brilliant colleagues acted for Paul and called his bluff and decided that they were going to fight the case, and 2 weeks beforehand he caved, and he's got a pretty huge legal bill, let me tell you. So I mean, that's a good example defensively, but just proactively, two, I think, very good news stories from last year, and that are an example of how in the David and Goliath battle we need to think about where we have a forum where we can creatively use the law in a way that protects us. So I want to give the example of Malta and Colombia. So in relation to Malta, we obviously had a situation with Daphne's assassination in 2017 where Malta was not doing what it's obliged to do under the European Convention on Human Rights. And one of the things we decided very early on was, well, Malta is a Council of Europe country, it's a European Union country, let's use the regional mechanisms which we've got available to hold Malta to account. And the result of that process was that we secured a public inquiry in order to comply with the right to life under the European Convention and freedom of expression under the European Convention, Articles 2 and 10 of the Convention. We secured a public inquiry which reported just at the end of last July 2021 in a 437-page report, which is absolutely brilliant. And what that report does is it identifies that Daphne's killing in 2017 was not a bolt from the blue. It was, in fact, a predictable and preventable death, and the state itself, the Maltese state, has responsibility for her death. And it's well worth a read. The report held that the state created an atmosphere of impunity generated from the highest echelons of the administration inside the Castile, the tentacles of which then spread to other institutions, such as the police and regulatory authorities, leading to a collapse in the rule of law. Now, it was interesting how we secured that, because, of course, because it's a Council of Europe country, the family could have exhausted their domestic remedies, gone through all of their domestic proceedings in the Maltese courts, and then ultimately gone to the European Court of Human Rights. That would probably have taken us in the region of 6 to 7 years. And what the family said to me right from the outset when I met them within days of Daphne's assassination was, we want a mechanism which gives us answers and ensures action and accountability before the investigative trail has gone cold. So what we decided to do was to use other mechanisms of the Council of Europe. So we used the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. We turned up, supported by some brilliant NGOs, to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and we highlighted right from the outset how Malta was not complying with its obligations. We gave legal advice to the family, which they then published. So we tried to short-circuit the process that would otherwise have taken 6 or 7 years. And ultimately what we got was the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe with the very brilliant Peter Omtzigt, who was appointed as a special rapporteur to look at the rule of law in Malta, saying to Malta, you've 3 months to set up an inquiry to comply with your obligations. And if you don't do it, there was an obvious threat that Malta could be sanctioned under Council of Europe mechanisms. So they set up the inquiry. But that's how we got it. We forced their hand. But we did that by using the regional mechanisms. And the other example I wanted to give is the Colombian case of Jeanette, Bedoya, Lima against Colombia. And again, if you haven't had the opportunity to look at that judgment, please do. It's from October last year. I gave expert evidence in the case for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, but it's the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruling that Colombia had violated Jeanette Bedoya Lima's rights, and indeed the rights of her mother, and it found that the Colombian state was responsible for her kidnapping, for her rape and her torture. Female journalist who was kidnapped, raped and tortured simply for doing her job. Now that happened 20 years previously. Climate of total impunity, no result within the Colombian system, so she went to the regional system, and importantly, this judgment draws very heavily on case law from the European Court of Human Rights, which we brought in, which her and her legal team brought in, which the Inter-American Commission brought in, and which we, through our expert evidence, brought in. So I think that's two really good examples of where the state is not doing its job. Colombia or Malta, use a regional system if you can. So there's some good news stories and proactive, creative use of the law. I've got to say, I feel bad saying they're good news stories, because obviously what lies behind those two cases is horrific failures by the state and horrific private pain for the journalists involved and for the family involved. But we must secure accountability in these cases, both for journalists like Jeanette Bedoya Lima, for Daphne Caruana Galizia, for their families, but also because unless we secure accountability and practical recommendations for change, many, many more journalists are at risk of the same things happening to them.
Thank you, Keelan. I'm going to turn to Twitter to see a couple of questions. There's actually a comment, and of course, Keelan is absolutely smashing it as always. But there's also a question, I guess, for you, Carlos. It comes from Thanos Citistas, who says, myself and my organization have received funding from Media Defense. We're very grateful for that. Should journalists go on the offensive and request funds for taking people that harass them to court? If so, who could provide this funding?
Oh, that's a very difficult question, because we don't want necessarily to incentivize lawsuits. But as Patricia said, sometimes you have to, depending on the level of harassment and the level of bullying or threats you're facing, you have to go to court to do it. I think in very specific circumstances, we can provide funding for that. These are rare instances in which we will support or fund an active case like that, but it is possible, definitely, and he should submit an application and send the information, and we'll go through it. And if not us, there's a group of NGOs in the network I mentioned, network of journalists at risk, or other NGOs with whom we work, who might be able to fund and provide support for that sort of initiative. So it's not unheard, but it's definitely something to can be considered. Yeah, absolutely.
Could I just come in on that as well?
Yes, and actually I have another question for you, Keelan.
Oh, sorry. So just on that point, I think this is such an important point that's been raised in the question about us being proactive. So not just waiting until the threats come to us and then firefighting and fighting back, but proactively thinking about what we can do. Now, there's a series of cases in the European Court of Human Rights, including a case called Dink, which is about the death of an investigative journalist, which refer to the need for there to be a climate which fosters investigative journalism and ensures that journalists are safe. Now, it seems to me we should be thinking proactively about holding states within the Council of Europe to account in that way. And as we've seen with the Colombian case, when you can have a line of case law developed well in the European Court of Human Rights, which is a very advanced system, you can potentially then try to argue that line of authority, for example, in the African system, in the Inter-American Commission system, and so on. So it seems to me we should be thinking about that Dink line of cases, about the need to ensure there's a climate which fosters investigative journalism. We should be thinking proactively about using that. And also, I mean, it does really frustrate me. I realize this is going to sound like a very frustrating thing for a lawyer to say, but, you know, I'm self-employed, as many of you are, and I do some pro bono work. Much of my work is low bono, and I simply cannot do a case which is a 4 or 5 year, very specialized case entirely for free. You know, nobody would expect a plumber to do it for free, you know, and nobody would expect you as journalists to do it for free either. And I think it seems to me that the people we're fighting against are often very well resourced. They've got all the cards, and we've got to be more willing to do, as say that Paul Radu example that I gave. You know, there you can do a case on a conditional fee agreement, so it's a kind of no-win, no fee. But ultimately, if you win the case, the person who has tried to weaponize the law against you should feel it in their pocket, you know? And actually, I think we've got to also think about not necessarily always doing these things pro bono. I think we need to think about doing it in a low bono way, or in a way where there's a real financial risk to the person on the other side who's weaponizing the law against you. And final thing to say is, it is worth giving some thought to the Justice for Journalists Foundation. Justice for Journalists Foundation obviously fund investigative journalism in many ways, but they also are increasingly looking at accountability for crimes against journalists, where journalists can actually work with lawyers. So in some of the cases which I'm currently doing, which involve deaths of journalists in war zones which have gone unpunished, what we're having to do is work closely with journalists. So the lawyers, the bereaved family, and the journalists are having to do the job that the states have failed to do. So by way of example, I act for the family of Anton Hammerl, who was a war photographer, a conflict journalist who was killed in Libya 11 years ago this week, actually, in what was undoubtedly a war crime, and which was witnessed by Jim Foley, whose trial is obviously, the trial relating to his later murder is now ongoing. But 4 journalists, 2 American journalists, Anton Hammerl, a South African, and Manu Brabo, a Spanish journalist, were kidnapped. They were the victims of Gaddafi forces setting upon them despite them being journalists. And during that scuffle, Anton was killed. And Anton was killed in what, undoubtedly from the materials I've seen, was a war crime, and which Jim Foley believed was a war crime. But 11 years later, there has not been an investigation into that death. There's been no answers for the bereaved family. There's been no accountability. And what we're now doing is, thanks to Diane Foley providing us with Jim's notebooks, we're now reconstructing the investigation which James Foley himself as a journalist was doing. And we're putting that together. But it's outrageous that a bereaved family, journalists and lawyers who are working in a very low bono way are having to do this job rather than states and rather than the international community. It's not good enough. And this comes at a time when we're seeing deaths very similar to Anton's happening in Ukraine. And we simply cannot have impunity for these kinds of deaths. And we should not have a ramshackle collection of us doing our job in that way when actually there are state bodies who simply have to step in. If Libya aren't doing the job, why are the international community not ensuring there's an investigation into a war crime that occurred 11 years ago? It's got to happen.
I actually want to go to Patricia next because obviously both Keelan and Carlos, you're based in London and you're doing phenomenal work out of London. Patricia, do you, a journalist coming from Brazil, do you feel that this level of support or mechanism is actually present in the Global South, especially in Brazil, where you are from?
That's okay. I think sometimes
and it's a genuine question, so I'm not hinting at no, it's not, but I'm actually intrigued to see whether there is this level of resistance, this level of, you know, another Keelan. Is there a Keelan in Brazil?
Hopefully spelled
no, there are no Keelans, unfortunately. Well, one of the things is when Keelan was talking about accountability and the way the states should be responsible, and how the states should be supporting the journalists or making it the environment good for investigative reporting. What if the government is actively sabotaging the whole investigative reporting and, you know, the whole, sometimes we discuss this, you need legislation to protect media outlets and to protect journalists and to ensure there's free. But what if you have the exact opposite? You have government that is actively doing the opposite with legislation, with everything. So then you have to go up to the Inter-American Commission, which I'm not sure, like, Bolsonaro gives a damn, you know, when you have the Inter-American Court saying, you know, this is outrageous and you can do this with journalists. I mean, you still have to do that, of course. I mean, if there's no external pressure, there's nothing. It's like silence. We're like normalizing everything. But still.
Kina, you want to jump in? And then we have closing thoughts because we have up time.
I just think on this, it obviously depends on the country in question, but one of the key things we always have to do is think about where's the leverage. So for example, I was acting for a cartoonist a number of years ago who was detained in Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea doesn't give a damn what the United Nations says. So, you know, it's not particularly helpful to get the United Nations special procedures, giving a statement. It's not directly helpful, but what they do really care about is private business. And what we were able to do was we were able to get very quickly, because time was of the essence, because the prison in which he was detained is a prison where there'd been a number of deaths and there were very serious concerns for his safety. We thought, what's a quick mechanism we can get where we can show there's a human rights concern and we can then try to mobilize international business. So we got some of the UN special rapporteurs, including the very brilliant Professor David Kay, to quickly show their support. So we were able to show them. And it wasn't because that UN statement was going to directly influence Equatorial Guinea. It's because with that, we were then able to go to senators in the US and say, this is outrageous, and tell us why these US companies are there in Equatorial Guinea, and we were able to put pressure that way. And each time, and we'd have to do the same with Brazil, I'm feeling a conversation coming on later, you need to think about, what's the pressure point? What's the leverage? What does this country respond to? Do they care about what the Human Rights Council says? Is there a way in which you can get to them through investment treaty arbitration type arguments? What's the pressure point? And the pressure point for UAE is wholly different to the pressure point for Egypt, to the pressure point for the Philippines. And that's the key thing. It's got to be a strategy which is country specific, where you work out how can you be creative, what tools can you use, and ultimately what's going to work.
Which I guess requires coordination also among lawyers. Closing thoughts, we're really out of time. Actually, we're 1 minute already beyond, but I just wanted to get 15 seconds each with the closing thoughts.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I think the examples given by Patricia and by Keelan are extraordinary and encourage us to work even more and further. And I think the examples she gave are great examples where there's coordination between civil society organizations and lawyers. In the case of Jeanette Bedoya at the Inter-American Court, she was an expert witness. We provided an amicus brief to the Inter-American Court, probably focusing on similar, on similar issues. But there was a concerted effort by a group of organizations around the world to support Jeanette in her quest for justice. So I think we need to do more of that and be more generous with our time to other journalists who are also demanding help, support in their legal struggles. Thank you very much. Yeah,
Patricia.
First I just wanted to say thank you, guys. We really need you guys. And then just real quick, in terms of leverage, I just remember that last year, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was in Brazil, and he was offering Brazil to be a member. It's not a member, it's like a partner, NATO partner, right? So we did all the stories telling, how the president was disputing election results before the results, how he was attacking civic integrity. And then you had US senators questioning, so why is the US doing, why is the US going? So I do believe in leverage and international pressure. I think that is really, really important.
Thank you, Patricia. Keelan.
Yeah, 2 quick points. First is, we spoke earlier about Daphne Caruana Galizia, but that climate of impunity was not specific to Malta. While that climate of impunity festered in Malta, the world stood idly by. The UK, European Union, Council of Europe, countries across Europe ignored what was going on under their noses and left Daphne to her fate. And I would say, it seems to me we quite often get empty words from states about the importance of press freedom, but actually they don't show up and take action when it really counts. And you can see that. Look at the Media Freedom Coalition. One of the first countries on the list is Afghanistan. How is Afghanistan still on the list for the Media Freedom Coalition months later? Yeah, but this is, it's completely ridiculous. All throughout September to December, we were saying, why is it there? How does it take them months to even deal with that? And final thought is, our enemies are organised and well-resourced and use the law in creative ways. We have got to be organised and well-resourced and use the law in creative ways. That's what we've got to do to protect and defend journalism.
Thank you, Keelan, Patricia, Carlos. Thank you for a fantastic panel. Thank you for being with us.